An empty blanket, untouched food, and a chilling question: who arranged it? Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. Comment below and share where you're listening from. Your presence makes this mystery unforgettable. Let's dive in. It was the sort of July afternoon St. Mary Mead did particularly well. Warm but not stifling, with just enough breeze to set the bunting fluttering from the hedgerows and make the vicar's hat tilt askew on his walk from the rectory. The air smelled of trampled grass, strawberry jam, and the faint spice of elderflower cordial. Birds chirped obligingly. Bees did what bees ought to. And the village, smug in its charm, leaned into the summer idyll, which made the basket beneath the beech tree all the more peculiar. It was found by young Emily Carstairs, aged 12, who had been sent to fetch her younger brother away from the cricket field. She saw it as she cut through the back of Little Bramble Hollow, an old shallow copse rarely used except by couples avoiding chaperones and dogs avoiding leashes. There, in a ring of dappled shade, sat a pristine gingham-lined picnic basket, chilled bottle of lemonade, slices of ham and mustard sandwiches, 2 raspberry tarts, and, curiously, no ants. Not a person in sight. The oddest thing, Emily later told her mother, was that one of the teacups, china, not plastic, had lipstick on its rim, smudged in a way that suggested haste or agitation. The second teacup was shattered beside the tree roots. Naturally, the girl left it alone and ran straight home. Or rather, as she confessed to her cousin Jonathan under solemn secrecy, she did take one of the tarts. Just the one. No one would notice. Not then. By that evening, the village was buzzing. Mrs. Vickers of the post office claimed to have seen a pale man in a dark coat hurrying toward the woods around tea time, sweating like a pig, she added, which she found indecent for July. The Reverend Chichester speculated, in his typically charitable way, that someone had perhaps eloped and left the food behind. "It happens, you know," he murmured over his pipe. "Emotions, nerves, the body sometimes forgets its appetite." But it was Colonel Denham who first used the word that would hang heavy over the week, like the fog over Bramble Hollow murder, because the next morning, behind the same beech tree where the tart had gone missing and the teacup had shattered, someone found the body. It was Miss Felicity Emberton, spinster, former music teacher at the girls' college in Bath, known for her brisk walks and a curious fondness for bitter marmalade. Her neck bore bruises in the shape of strong fingers, and her white gloves were still on, pristine save for the palm of the right one, where a small tear revealed a thumbnail bloodied to the quick. No one had seen her arrive. No one had seen her leave. No one knew why she would picnic alone or with whom. At the time of discovery, Miss Jane Marple was knitting a new antimacassar on her front porch, having just returned from a brief but unsatisfactory visit to her niece in Eastbourne. She had heard the news from her gardener, who recounted it in the same breath as a warning about aphids in the west rosebed. Miss Marple said nothing, but she paused just briefly in her stitching. Her expression did not change, yet her blue eyes grew distant, almost preoccupied. "Murder in Bramble Hollow, you say?" she murmured after a moment. "Dear me, that's rather like the incident in Ipswich, though I dare say this one involves a great deal more raspberry tart," and with that she returned to her knitting. But her mind, sharp as ever beneath her white lace cap, was already beginning its quiet work. For Jane Marple knew a great many things, about how people behaved when frightened, how secrets fermented in a quiet village, and most especially how no one ever truly has a picnic alone, not without reason, not without consequence. Miss Marple had always maintained that in a village such as St. Mary Mead, the truth seldom lay buried long. People talked. They repeated things, and then, quite without realizing, they corrected themselves. It was in those little corrections, those slight contradictions and subtle revisions, that the truth could be traced like a thread through linen. All one needed was patience, and ears sharp enough to catch the shift in pitch between what someone wanted you to hear and what they accidentally revealed. By the afternoon of the second day, the shock of Miss Emberton's death had settled like a grey veil over the village. There was no more delight in the July sun, no more laughter in the shops. Even Mr. Barnes at the grocer's, normally jolly and red-faced, packed the morning's potatoes in silence. No one quite knew what to do with themselves. After all, Miss Emberton hadn't been beloved exactly, but she was familiar. She had opinions about classical music and disliked children under 10, and had once written a furious letter to the newspaper about the inappropriateness of American jazz at the Women's Guild Christmas social. Still murdered. It was unthinkable. At the vicarage, Reverend Chichester set out folding chairs in the garden, under the impression that the community needed spiritual comfort, or perhaps something to do. His wife Clarissa made seed cake that no one quite enjoyed, but everyone nibbled out of duty. The Marlowe twins sat on the lawn whispering. Old Mrs. Bletchley wept into her tea and claimed she had seen a shadowy man pass her window 3 nights earlier, and that it meant something, though she admitted she couldn't now recall which. Widow Miss Marple came a little late, having taken her time crossing the green. She walked slowly, which she found people preferred. It made her appear doddering and thus harmless. But her mind was keen and clear, sifting through the small exchanges with an ear for irregularities. Colonel Denham was holding court beneath a pear tree. "Strangled," he declared, voice like a whip crack. Clear case of rage, intimate, very likely someone she knew well, someone she argued with. "You mark me, there'll be a man involved somewhere." "Quiet one's the worst." Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, merely said, "Oh, I do wonder. Some people argue quite without passion. I once knew a lady who quarrelled daily with her sister, yet never raised her voice. It was only when she stopped arguing that the poor girl went missing. A very interesting case, rather sadly resolved." The colonel blinked at her, as if uncertain whether to take that seriously, and harumphed instead. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray of Much Benham had arrived that morning to take over the case from the village constable, who was plainly out of his depth. Cray was a broad man with a plain face and a faintly harried expression, as though perpetually one clue short of an answer. He had visited the crime scene again at dawn, made several notes, and questioned Mr. Ellis, the gamekeeper, who reported seeing a figure near the hollow the evening before, but couldn't say whether it was a man or a woman. Could have been either, with the way the shadows were. Tall, though. Light on the feet. Moved quick. None of it was particularly helpful. The only concrete detail came from Miss Hartnell, stout, sharp-nosed and nearly blind, who claimed Miss Emberton had been seen the day before in a pale blue dress and wearing gloves. "Gloves in this weather," she'd said in tones of censure. "That tells you something right there." It told Miss Marple quite a bit. She sat quietly at the vicarage gathering, speaking little, watching much. Mrs. Abernathy, the widowed pharmacist's sister, had an odd flutter about her. Her eyes darted too quickly, her hands too still in her lap. Her husband, who had died under unremarkable circumstances 4 years prior, had been one of Miss Emberton's former pupils. That alone was not enough to draw suspicion, but it was an angle. More interesting, however, was Miss Cora Langley. Cora had arrived in the village a month earlier, renting rooms above the milliner's. She was perhaps in her late 30s, stylishly plain in a way that suggested deliberate restraint, with a calm voice and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Miss Marple had already observed that she rarely offered opinions and often asked precise, thoughtful questions. That afternoon, seated near the tea table, she remarked to no one in particular, "How strange that someone would prepare such a perfect picnic and then break a cup. That suggests, don't you think, a quarrel?" "Oh, undoubtedly," said Mrs. Vickers at once. "She must have met someone there. A lover, perhaps, or someone who disapproved of her. Modern ideas. You know how she was about the piano in the church." Miss Marple's eyes remained on her yarn, but her thoughts turned inward. A quarrel. A broken teacup. A lipstick trace. The lipstick was the real oddity. Miss Emberton, as far as she recalled, wore very little makeup. Pale powder, yes, but never lipstick. Too vain about her teeth. So if the lipstick was not hers, it must have belonged to someone else who had joined her there, someone female. The police had seemed to assume a male assailant from the force used in the strangulation. That would have been true in most cases, but not all. Later that evening, Miss Marple ventured into the churchyard. She often did so when puzzling. The quiet helped. So did the names on the stones, reminders of stories that had once been urgent and secret, now reduced to dates and titles. She passed the Emberton plot. Her father had been a stern man, a justice of the peace. Her mother, known locally for organizing flower shows, had died in 1923. Felicity herself had lived alone in the cottage on Lower Heath Lane ever since her early retirement from the school. No family, no close friends, but she had recently begun writing letters again. Miss Marple knew this because she had seen her at the post office twice in the past fortnight, looking oddly cheerful. Not a description one would usually apply to Felicity Emberton. A new correspondence suggested a renewal of some old connection, possibly even reconciliation, or perhaps a last effort to right a wrong. The next morning brought a new wrinkle. Mrs. Vickers, in a state of considerable excitement, reported to the constable that she had seen a scarf, silk blue, with a faint rose pattern, caught on a thorn bush just off the path to Bramble Hollow. "It wasn't there the day before," she insisted. "I always look at that hedge. That's the one where the sparrows sit." It was recovered promptly. There was a faint blood smear on one corner, not fresh, and a tiny perfume label sewn into the hem. La Parisienne. Not a scent Miss Emberton would have chosen. Inspector Cray called in the village ladies for questions. One by one they came through the hall of the parish rooms, answering politely. Some were vague, some overly specific. Most denied knowing anything at all. When it was Miss Langley's turn, she entered quietly, sat with her hands folded, and answered with calm precision. No, she had not known Miss Emberton well. Yes, she had seen her in the village. No, she had not been to the Hollow. And no, she had never owned a blue silk scarf, though she admired them. Miss Marple, who had come ostensibly to deliver a cake for the constable, happened to overhear just enough, and it was in that moment, a brief hesitation, a barely perceptible glance toward the scarf on the table, that something slid into place. Not proof. Not yet, but a beginning, a direction. Miss Marple took her leave soon after, thanking the constable, smiling pleasantly at the inspector, and nodding to Miss Langley in passing. She walked home with a small frown between her brows. One did not need lipstick to be dangerous. One needed motive, opportunity, and, most critically, an understanding of how to lie without seeming to. But people were never quite as clever at hiding themselves as they thought. Miss Marple knew that by the time the week ended, someone in St. Mary Mead would find that out the hard way. The death of Miss Felicity Emberton hung over St. Mary Mead not like a storm, but like a long, low cloud, unmoving, heavy, and quietly oppressive. Though life resumed in the usual rhythms, something about it had changed. Children played more quietly, dogs barked less, and the gossip, never absent in St. Mary Mead, had taken on a brittle edge. Every conversation now contained a glance over the shoulder, every cheerful wave a hesitation. The day after the silk scarf was discovered, the village awoke to the sound of hammering at the church hall. Inspector Cray had commandeered the place for further interviews. With growing suspicion that Miss Emberton had not simply been the victim of a random crime, he was now treating nearly everyone who had spoken to her in the past fortnight as a person of interest, a phrase which sent Mrs. Bartlett into a swoon and prompted Dr. Hayward to warn against excessive, emotional displays in women of a certain constitution. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, tatting a lace edge for a christening gown that would not be used until the new Ellison baby arrived in October. She listened quietly as Miss Polk, the retired headmistress, expressed her outrage over being called in for questioning, as if I'd strangled her myself. Miss Marple murmured, "People often become indignant when asked to explain things they consider private. But privacy, when misunderstood, can appear very much like concealment." Mrs. Polk sniffed and said nothing. What interested Miss Marple was not the police's approach, though she found it respectfully methodical, but the choice of individuals they seemed to overlook, most notably young Jonathan Carstairs, the same boy whose sister had found the picnic basket. At first his involvement seemed limited to that detail, but Miss Marple recalled a remark from Emily, overheard at the bakery. Jonathan hated Miss Emberton, said she was an old devil with piano fingers like claws, and yet Jonathan had never been called to the parish hall. Children were often dismissed too easily, but Miss Marple had long known they saw everything, and often remembered what adults would rather forget. That morning, she took a stroll to the Carstairs cottage under the pretense of returning a spoon. Mrs. Carstairs, broad-hipped, kind-faced, and usually brimming with conversation, answered the door with eyes slightly puffy and a smile that faltered halfway. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, ushering her in. "How thoughtful. That spoon. I'd quite forgotten. Please do come in." The front room smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and lavender polish. Jonathan was seated on the hearth rug with a book spread across his lap. Robinson Crusoe, by the look of it. But he barely looked up. Miss Marple sat gently in the wooden rocker by the window. "Jonathan, dear," she said, "you must be quite shaken, what with all this talk in the village." Jonathan shrugged. "I didn't know her well, didn't you now?" Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. "And yet I remember seeing you at her gate last week, carrying a parcel. Brown paper, very carefully held. Such things tend to stick in my mind." Jonathan blinked. That was just sheet music. For the vicar's wife. She asked me to fetch it." His voice trembled slightly on the last syllable. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Of course, sheet music. So hard to come by these days, isn't it? Especially the older pieces Miss Emberton was fond of. She did love her back. She must have appreciated your effort." Jonathan said nothing. Mrs. Carstairs busied herself at the sideboard. "I didn't think much of it. He runs errands for the vicar's wife often. And Miss Emberton, well, she had her ways." "She did indeed," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, my dear, did you ever see her speak with the new lady, Miss Langley?" Mrs. Carstairs turned with a start. "Cora Langley? No, I don't think so. Though I did once see Miss Langley outside Miss Emberton's cottage. Looked like she was about to knock, then changed her mind. Strange now I think of it." "Quite." Miss Marple looked at Jonathan again, but the boy had lowered his eyes to the book. He was no longer reading. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a call to Dr. Hayward under the pretense of inquiring about a pain in her thumb. She was shown into the surgery immediately, though the doctor's expression was impatient. "Nothing broken, nothing sprained," he said after examining her hand. "I expect a touch of rheumatism. Mustn't be surprised at our age, Miss Marple," she smiled. "Of course not. But while I'm here, I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment's conversation about Miss Emberton." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "I've already spoken to Inspector Cray, I'm sure. But there are things a lady may notice, delicate things. For instance, you were treating her for some time, were you not? I wonder, had she spoken recently about her sleep? Or her nerves?" Dr. Hayward hesitated. "She had on occasion mentioned unease. Vague symptoms, fatigue, mood fluctuations. I chalked it up to isolation. She had no family, and I believe something from her past still troubled her. She once hinted at a mistake." "What sort of mistake?" "She didn't say, but she used the phrase, 'something I was forced into.' I assumed it was an unhappy love affair. She was once engaged, I think, but it ended badly." "Did she ever name the gentleman?" Dr. Hayward shook his head. "No, and I didn't pry. She was of the generation that rarely unburdened themselves, even to physicians." Miss Marple nodded. "No need for details. But it does help to know. Thank you." As she left the surgery, she paused on the step. An engagement. A mistake. A woman waiting for something, perhaps someone, to return. On impulse, she turned toward the post office. Inside, she found Miss Drew, the postmistress, cataloguing parcels with her usual military precision. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, looking up. "I've just missed the afternoon dispatch. But I can put something through for the next one." Miss Marple smiled. "Actually, I wondered if Miss Emberton had any outgoing mail recently. I seem to recall her asking about international postage not long ago." Miss Drew nodded. "She did. Sent a letter to France. To Nice, I believe. And one to London as well. Same handwriting. Different names. Did she receive any replies?" "Yes, about a week ago. Both from London this time. One of them was marked 'Return to Sender.' I think she picked it up herself." Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. A letter to France unanswered. A reply from London, perhaps unexpected. Her hidden connection trying to resurface. She returned home with a sense of something about to break. That evening, as the sun set over the gables of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple took her cup of tea in the parlour and watched the shadows lengthen across the garden. She had nearly all the pieces now. What remained was the question of why, not the method. Strangulation was personal, panicked, desperate. But motive, always the motive. It would not be long before someone made a mistake, someone always did, and Miss Marple, smiling gently, sat back in her chair and waited. The third morning after the discovery of Miss Emberton's body dawned damp and grey, the kind of morning that made lace curtains hang limp and turned the village green into a shallow swamp. The mood in St. Mary Mead matched the weather, soggy, sullen and muttering to itself. Inside the High Street Cafe, teacups clinked with unusual restraint. Mrs. Bartlett stirred her sugar into silence, and even Mr. Sims, who usually commented loudly on everything from cricket scores to the price of haddock, kept his voice to a respectful murmur. Inspector Cray had made no arrest. Rumours had begun to curl like smoke from every doorway that Felicity Emberton had been blackmailing someone, that she had received threatening letters, that she had a secret fiancé, that she had been spotted arguing at the chemist. All of them possible, all of them unconfirmed. Miss Marple, having spent the morning tidying her garden and overhearing 2 very informative remarks from Mrs. Pierce over the fence, now stood quietly in the corner of the greengrocer's shop, inspecting apples with the air of one who has all the time in the world. She did not, in fact, care much for apples in June, but they gave her an excuse to listen. Mr. Ellison. The greengrocer himself was speaking softly with Miss Cora Langley, who held a paper bag with precisely 4 carrots and a look of careful detachment. "Terrible business, isn't it?" he said. "Don't reckon she had any real enemies. Not the sort to do that." Cora smiled faintly. "People surprise you. Some wounds go on bleeding underneath, long after they seem healed. I suppose even the quiet ones have reasons." It was a thoughtful comment, too thoughtful. And Miss Marple, as she added 2 Granny Smiths to her basket and approached the till, noted the peculiar way Miss Langley held her left hand, a slight curl of the fingers, as if concealing something. She also noted, though she did not show it, the very faint smell of La Parisienne perfume, now mostly faded, but unmistakable. As Miss Marple stepped out into the grey morning, she turned over the facts again. A scarf with a scent, a shattered teacup, lipstick on the rim, Miss Emberton's gloves, intact except for the bloodied nail, and a woman who had arrived in the village with no real history and who answered every question just slightly too well. But to act, one needed more than suspicion. Miss Marple returned home to find a note had been pushed through her door. It was written on heavy cream paper, in a fine hand. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes of your time. I would be grateful for a discreet conversation. Yours sincerely, Cora Langley." It was not unexpected. Miss Marple tucked the note into her pocket, boiled the kettle and prepared 2 cups of tea. Cora Langley arrived 20 minutes later, dressed in slate grey with gloves, her hair pinned back neatly. Her face was composed, her eyes watchful. "Do come in, Miss Langley," Miss Marple said warmly. "It's so unpleasant out. I hope you don't mind Earl Grey." "Not at all," Cora said, sitting on the edge of the armchair as if uncertain whether she was welcome or on trial. I've felt a little unsteady, to tell the truth." "Well, that's only natural," said Miss Marple gently. "You've been very near a most distressing event." Cora sipped her tea. "You've probably already guessed why I'm here." Miss Marple looked at her, calm and kind. "I seldom guess, but I do listen." Cora's lips parted. She hesitated. Then she spoke. "I did know Miss Emberton. Years ago. I was her pupil briefly in Bath. She taught piano. She was very precise, cold almost, but brilliant. My father withdrew me from her instruction after 3 months. There was a quarrel." "What sort of quarrel?" "She accused him of trying to take liberties with her." He denied it, publicly at least, but he never brought charges. He simply paid her to disappear. I believe it ruined her." Miss Marple blinked slowly. "And you?" "I was 15. I didn't know who to believe. I told myself she was lying, but I knew she wasn't." There was silence for a long moment. "Did you come to St. Mary Mead to make amends?" Miss Marple asked. Cora gave a short laugh. "I thought I did. I wrote to her twice. She never replied. But when I saw her here, I panicked. I couldn't speak to her. Though I think she recognized me. The day before she died, I saw her near the baker's. She looked straight at me. And she looked afraid." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "That doesn't make you a murderer, Miss Langley. But it does give you a motive. I didn't kill her." Her voice was firm. "I was afraid she'd expose my father, after all these years. But I swear to you, I didn't lay a finger on her." Miss Marple studied her, her gaze soft but unflinching. Very well. Let's say I believe you. Then the question remains, who else might have feared what she knew? Or what she might say? Cora's face changed. There was a man, she said slowly, middle-aged, heavy-set. I saw him leaving Miss Emberton's garden one evening about a week ago. He looked furious. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now— Miss Marple leaned forward. Would you know him again? I think so. He was wearing a hat. But his walk, his shape, I'd seen it before. That evening, Miss Marple walked alone to the vicarage, asking for a quiet word with Reverend Chichester. It was not the vicar she wanted, but the photograph in his study, the one taken at the harvest fete last year, where several dozen villagers stood smiling before the great marquee, including Miss Emberton. Including the man in the hat, Miss Marple asked to borrow the photograph. By candlelight at home, she studied it carefully. There, back row, a tall, florid-faced man with a heavy moustache and a slightly bent left leg, Mr. Graves, the village solicitor. Retired now, widowed. He had once served on the school board in Bath. She remembered it now. He had been dismissed quietly, after a scandal never fully explained. She sat back and let the silence settle. Miss Emberton had begun writing letters. One had gone to London. A man had returned, looking to silence her. A secret hidden 20 years, and of course the final piece, the gloves, still worn at the picnic. Gloves worn even while drinking tea. Unless, of course, the person she met had worn them instead. And Miss Emberton had scratched, drawing blood through the thin cotton. Miss Marple rose. Her hands trembled only slightly as she drew her shawl closer and reached for the telephone. She asked for Inspector Cray. I believe, she said calmly, that I may have some helpful information about the identity of Miss Emberton's killer. But I suggest you act swiftly. If I'm right, they've just begun to realize they didn't destroy every trace. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, behind one of those tidy, lace-curtained windows, someone, man or woman, was beginning to feel very nervous indeed. Inspector Cray arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just before 8 that evening. The sky outside was low and blue, darkening to purple at the edges. A storm was threatening, and the warm air held a heavy stillness, as if the village itself were holding its breath. He looked weary. A man used to tidy thefts and the occasional rural scuffle. He had not bargained for murder in St. Mary Mead, let alone one tangled in old secrets and genteel silences. Miss Marple received him with a pot of black tea and ginger, biscuits, and waited until he had taken 2 sips before speaking. I believe your investigation has been hindered by politeness, she said without preamble. Not yours necessarily, but ours. You see, we're a terribly discreet village, Inspector. We mind our own business publicly, and everyone else's privately. Cray gave her a tired smile. I'm beginning to notice that. I think I can point you toward the man who killed Miss Emberton, she said gently. And I believe you already know his name. Cray straightened slightly. Go on. Miss Marple reached across to the low table beside her and produced the photograph from the vicarage. She placed it between them, her finger pointing to the heavy-set figure in the back row. Mr. Owen Graves, solicitor, formerly of Bath. He served on the school board when Miss Emberton taught at the girls' college. Cray's eyes narrowed. He's retired, keeps to himself. I interviewed him briefly. He said he hadn't seen her in years. Yes, Miss Marple said. He lied. She paused, allowing that to settle. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the ivy against the window panes. She recognized him when he returned, she continued, and I believe he recognized her. She had been writing letters, some of which went unanswered. Others, it seems, drew precisely the kind of response she had hoped to avoid. I think Miss Emberton had decided to speak out at last. Or perhaps she only wished for an apology. But she was preparing to confront him. And when she did, Cray set down his teacup with a soft clink. You believe he followed her to the hollow? No, said Miss Marple, eyes bright. I believe she invited him. That picnic was not hers alone. There were 2 cups, 2 sandwiches, 2 tarts. She expected someone. She prepared a meeting, Cray said slowly, with her gloves on. With her gloves on. Because she feared him, or wanted to protect herself. But she brought a teacup with lipstick on it, not hers, and a second cup broken. That suggests an argument, a struggle. Perhaps he tried to leave and she tried to stop him, or threatened to expose him. She clawed at him, Cray murmured, catching up. Tore her own glove. That explains the blood beneath her nail. The coroner said it wasn't hers. Miss Marple nodded. And the scarf. Left behind in panic. It likely belonged to someone else. Miss Langley, I believe, who may have been there earlier or later, seeking her own resolution. But I don't think she committed the murder. Cray stared at her. You've spoken to Miss Langley. She came to me. She had reason to fear Miss Emberton might name her father in connection with a long-ago scandal. But I don't think she was prepared to kill to stop her. But Graves was. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, and now I suspect he's wondering how much Miss Emberton told before her death. Whether she confided in someone. Left evidence. Cray stood up, face grim. Then I'd better speak to Mr. Graves again. Thoroughly this time. Miss Marple hesitated. Inspector, if I might make a suggestion. He raised an eyebrow. She was a teacher. He was a man in authority. She trusted the rules and the institution. He betrayed that. If you confront him directly, he'll deny everything. But if you suggest gently that her letters have already reached someone and that someone intends to go public, you may find his fear speaks more eloquently than your questions. Cray gave her a long look. You're not a policewoman, Miss Marple. Certainly not, she agreed cheerfully. But people do tend to tell me things. An hour later, Inspector Cray knocked on the door of the ivy-draped house on Ash Tree Lane. Owen Graves answered it in shirt sleeves, spectacles perched low on his nose, a book in one hand. He looked exactly as a retired solicitor ought, calm, reasonable, and slightly distracted. Inspector, something I can help you with? I'd like a word, sir. About Miss Emberton. Still? Graves gave a sigh. I told you I hadn't spoken to the woman in 20 years. Yes, but it turns out she may have spoken to someone else, Cray said easily, stepping past him into the hallway. Left a letter or two. Perhaps some details she had never shared before. Graves stiffened. What kind of details? Something about a member of the Bath School Board, Cray said. A man she claimed had interfered with more than just policy. She mentioned names. The hallway was quiet. The storm outside had not yet broken, but it was near enough that the light had changed. Shadows moved across the floor. Graves's hand tightened on the book. She was a bitter woman. Everyone knew that. Cray turned to him. And sometimes bitterness grows from truth, doesn't it? Graves said nothing. His face was pale now, drawn. She invited someone to a picnic, Cray said softly. A reconciliation, perhaps. Or a confrontation. We know she was frightened. She wore gloves on a hot July day. One glove torn, a scratch on her nail. The blood wasn't hers. Coincidence, Graves said. But the word was empty. It fell flat between them. You knew she might talk, Cray said. You went to meet her. Perhaps she threatened you. Perhaps she only reminded you of what you'd done. And you— I didn't plan to, Graves said suddenly. The words burst from him. She started accusing me. Said she was going to the police, to the papers. She was wrong about what happened. It wasn't like that. She always made things worse, always had to be the one in control. And so you silenced her. Graves looked down at his hands. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to frighten her. She grabbed my arm. I pushed her. She slipped. Then why didn't you go for help? She was still breathing, he whispered. I thought if she woke up it would all come back again. The scandal. The headlines. Everything I'd built gone. He sat down on the bottom step of the stairs. A broken, hollow man, Cray didn't speak. He simply took out the cuffs. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple sipped her tea as the first thunder rolled across the village. She was not surprised. The truth had a way of surfacing just before the storm broke. Always had. There was a knock at the door. When she opened it, Cora Langley stood on the step, rain starting to bead on her coat. You were right, she said softly. It wasn't me. No, my dear, said Miss Marple. But it could have been. That's the thing with secrets. If you carry them too long, someone else might pay the price. Cora looked away. Will they charge him? Yes, he's confessed, Cora swallowed. And her name, will it be cleared? Miss Marple reached out and took her hand. That part, I think, is up to you. The younger woman nodded. Then I'll see to it. As the rain began to fall in earnest, they stood together a moment longer in the doorway. Two women separated by decades, bound by a shared understanding that truth, once set in motion, could not be buried, not even beneath the beech tree in Bramble Hollow. The following morning, A dense post-storm fog clung to the lanes of St. Mary Mead like a veil. Leaves glistened with rain, and puddles along the footpaths reflected grey skies. It was the sort of damp that crawled up one's sleeves and into one's bones. But even in the gloom, the village felt lighter, less burdened, as though something noxious had been lifted from the air. Word of Owen Graves's arrest spread quickly, though few knew the details. The official statement released by Inspector Cray was restrained. Mr. Graves is assisting the police with their inquiries, but among the regulars at the post office, the bakers and the tea shop, speculation flourished like mould on a damp sponge. Miss Marple, however, did not indulge in idle conversation that morning. She took her breakfast late, finishing a second cup of tea while watching the fog curl around her garden. There was no particular satisfaction in being proven right, not when it ended with a woman strangled in the grass and a man staring down the remainder of his life from behind bars. No. What lingered in Miss Marple's mind wasn't resolution, but something quieter, more elusive, the matter of intention. She could not help but wonder. Had Miss Emberton truly meant to expose Owen Graves? Or had she only sought some final private absolution? And what of the others touched by the long-ago incident in Bath? Had silence protected them, or merely postponed the damage? The Morning Post arrived with a single envelope, addressed in a firm, elegant hand. Inside was a note from Cora Langley. Dear Miss Marple, I've decided to remain in St. Mary Mead a little longer. There's something restful about it now. The truth sits more comfortably here than it did in Bath. I've taken rooms nearer the village green and begun helping at the lending library. You were right. Secrets fester. They demand payment, whether you're the one who kept them or not. I shall write again soon. With gratitude. Sale Miss Marple read the note twice, folded it, and slipped it into the drawer where she kept a modest collection of letters, some cheerful, some sorrowful, all part of her quiet record of human nature. She believed it was not a policeman's duty alone to know what people were capable of. That knowledge belonged to anyone who had lived long enough to watch tempers fray, friendships unravel, and pride swallow apologies. She was about to return to her knitting when there came another knock on the door. This time, it was young Jonathan Carstairs. He stood awkwardly, cap in hand, cheeks flushed, looking as though he might either bolt or cry. I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Marple, he mumbled. Mum said I shouldn't, but I just... She stepped aside without a word and gestured to the chair beside the hearth. He sat, but only on the edge, like someone waiting to be scolded. I didn't lie, he said at once. Not really. I just didn't say everything. Miss Marple poured him a glass of barley water and waited. I went to the Hollow that day, Jonathan continued, before Emily found the basket. I saw the picnic, and I saw the man, Mr. Graves. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Go on. He was kneeling next to her. Miss Emberton. His hands were shaking. He kept looking around like he didn't know what to do. I hid behind a tree. I was scared. Then he got up, grabbed something from the basket and left. And you didn't tell anyone? I was afraid, he admitted. He looked like he'd kill me too if he saw me. And I thought, maybe he'd get away with it if no one knew. But then people started saying it was an accident, or that someone else did it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I still see it in my dreams. Miss Marple patted his hand. You were brave to come now, Jonathan. Telling the truth late is still telling the truth. He looked at her, eyes wide. Do you think she knew he'd hurt her? I think she knew it was a risk, Miss Marple said. But sometimes, when a person has been frightened for a very long time, the fear changes. They decide that being heard is more important than being safe. He nodded slowly and stood. Thank you, Miss Marple. After he left, she sat still for a long while, her knitting untouched in her lap. The courage of children always surprised her more than the cowardice of adults. By mid-afternoon, the fog had begun to lift. The village seemed to blink and stretch, shaking off its chill. A small cluster of villagers had gathered near the green, inspecting the notice board outside the parish hall. It bore an announcement in thick black type, a memorial recital for Miss Felicity Emberton, Wednesday at 6 p.m., to include selections from Bach and Chopin, performed by local pupils. All welcome. Donations in her name to the St. Mary Mead Girls Fund. Miss Marple read the notice and was not surprised to find Cora Langley's signature at the bottom. The recital, when it came, was a modest affair. Chairs set in rows, a small table of seed cake and lemonade at the back, and 3 nervous schoolgirls taking turns at the piano. The vicar gave a few words about Miss Emberton's dedication to musical education and her unwavering standards. There was no mention of how she died, nor of what had prompted her final days. But everyone in the room felt the weight of it. And in the back row, Miss Marple observed more than one tear discreetly dabbed away behind a gloved hand. After the last notes of Claire de Lune faded, there was a moment of silence not requested, but universally observed, for Miss Emberton, for the truth, and perhaps for all the things people in small villages do not say. But live with anyway. Cora Langley found Miss Marple as the crowd began to thin. She was a difficult woman, Cora said quietly, but she tried to be brave. I think in the end that's what matters. It does, Miss Marple said. Bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it only whispers, "Come to the hollow." "Bring the tea," Cora smiled faintly. "Will you walk back with me?" They strolled slowly through the village, past the still damp flower beds and the shop fronts with their windows rewashed after the rain. They passed the beech tree, now cordoned off, for the constables had left it marked as part of an active scene. There, at the base of the trunk, someone had left a single white lily. Miss Marple paused. People never think teachers notice, but they do. Every harsh word, every kindness withheld, every child who pretends not to care. Cora said nothing, but she bowed her head. When they reached Miss Marple's gate, she turned to the younger woman. "You must write about her," she said. "Tell her story properly. Not the gory parts, not the trial or the letters or the foolish man who tried to silence her, but the part where she chose to speak." "I will," Cora promised. "And I'll name her properly, too." Miss Marple smiled, nodded once, and disappeared into her neat little cottage with its cat and its roses, and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. St. Mary Mead was returning to itself, but it would not quite be the same, nor should it be. The summer days in St. Mary Mead grew longer and warmer, as if nature were eager to restore the tranquil, postcard prettiness of the village after the disruption of murder. But some things, once disturbed, do not slip back into place so easily. Though the case of Miss Felicity, Emberton's death was now officially concluded, Owen Graves having been remanded for trial in London on charges of murder and obstruction, the village continued to murmur. There were fewer whispers now, less speculation and more of a quiet, almost embarrassed reflection. One does not enjoy gossip when it ends in such a solemn fashion. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to believe the stillness meant peace. What had been uncovered during the investigation was not only a crime of passion or shame, but a wider question of memory, how people forget the injustices they do not witness and choose to forgive those they admire. That question took a new and rather unexpected form 1 week later. When Miss Hartnell knocked on Miss Marple's front door, her hat askew and her expression more pinched than usual, "I don't like to be a nuisance," she said, without conviction, "but I thought you should hear it from me rather than from someone less discreet." Miss Marple ushered her in at once and poured her a cup of tea. Miss Hartnell did not drink it. Instead, she pulled a slim envelope from her handbag and set it down with the ceremonious air of someone laying a formal accusation at court. It arrived in this morning's post. For Miss Emberton, postmarked before her death. Miss Marple raised a brow. "You receive Miss Emberton's letters now?" "I do not," Miss Hartnell huffed. "But her landlady, poor Mrs. Pike, asked me to collect anything still arriving. And this," she tapped the envelope, "has a London return address. Miss Emberton's own handwriting on the front. But look," Miss Marple opened the envelope with careful fingers. Inside was a letter, not written by Miss Emberton, but addressed to her. "Dear Felicity, I do not know if you will ever forgive me for staying silent. You gave up more than I ever realized. I was a coward. If you truly wish to come forward, I will support you. But you must understand he knows people. He is still dangerous. Please be careful." There was no surname, but the tone was unmistakable. This was a letter from someone who had known both Miss Emberton and Owen Graves, and who had been complicit in their silence. Miss Marple stared at the signature. "Ah," she murmured, "so the story is not yet entirely told." Miss Hartnell, who had expected praise for her good sense in delivering the letter, looked slightly disappointed. "You're not surprised?" "Oh, I'm always surprised," Miss Marple said mildly. I simply no longer let it interrupt my thinking. The identity of R preoccupied her for the next day and a half. It was clear the writer had been part of the original scandal in Bath, perhaps a fellow teacher or board member, or confidant. Their letter suggested regret, even guilt, but also a warning. Miss Marple, who had cultivated many acquaintances in Bath over the years, penned 2 inquiries, one to a former headmistress now living in Torquay, and another to a cousin of hers who once worked as a clerk at the Bath Music Society. By the 3rd morning, she had her answer. The headmistress replied, R must be Richard Everley. He was head of the trustees at the time, though very junior, kept out of the direct scandal. But everyone knew he disapproved of the way Miss Emberton was treated. I always thought he might speak up one day. Apparently he never did. The name triggered something else in Miss Marple's mind, an article she'd clipped months ago, from the Times literary supplement, about a new charity patron named Richard Everley, who had recently endowed a scholarship for young women in music. She returned to her files, found the clipping, and read again the brief quote, "In honor of a remarkable teacher who never received her due." It was dated just a few weeks before Miss Emberton's death. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, the real reckoning had already begun, quietly, subtly, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in gestures of atonement. Still, the letter was important. She delivered it with due discretion to Inspector Cray, who by then had developed a healthy respect for Miss Marple's instincts. Cray nodded as he read. It fills in the motive a little more, doesn't it? Yes, Miss Marple said. But more importantly, it shows us that Miss Emberton was not alone in her final weeks. She had allies. Even if they came too late. Cray folded the letter and sighed. I'll forward this to the Crown's office. Might be of use at trial. As she stepped back into the summer sunlight, Miss Marple thought not of courts or verdicts, but of Miss Emberton's gloved hands and quiet, strained dignity. What she had faced mostly alone, but perhaps not entirely. In the weeks that followed, things in St. Mary Mead continued to mend. The hollow, once darkened by suspicion, was gradually reclaimed by the children of the village, who soon forgot all but the faint yellow tape that fluttered like bunting between the trees. Cora Langley, now fully part of the community, took over a weekly girls' reading group and offered free piano lessons every Thursday. She never spoke publicly of Miss Emberton, but her playing said more than words ever could, and Jonathan Carstairs, who had faced his fears with a bravery few adults would match, was quietly awarded a local commendation by the constable's office. Miss Marple made him a small knitted bookmark and left it in a copy of Treasure Island at the lending library. He said nothing, but he kept the book. On the first day of September, as the leaves began to dry and fall in crisp patches along the lane, Miss Marple took her usual seat on the bench across from the church. She was joined unexpectedly by Reverend Chichester. Peaceful day, he remarked. Yes, Miss Marple replied, though peace is often hard won. He gave her a searching look. You always seem to know more than the rest of us. I pay attention, she said simply. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Finally, the vicar said, You know, people speak of Miss Emberton differently now. There's a kind of reverence in their voices. I think they're beginning to understand what she endured. Understanding, said Miss Marple, is the first step. But remembrance is the next. If the village forgets, then she is lost again. And I don't think she could bear another silence. The vicar nodded solemnly. As the bells tolled for midday, a breeze stirred the dry leaves, and the faint scent of honeysuckle returned to the air. Miss Marple reached into her handbag, took out a scrap of soft linen, and resumed her knitting. The threads looped together neatly, each stitch purposeful, because justice, like a good pattern, must be both carefully observed and patiently constructed. And in St. Mary Mead, under the quiet eye of a very perceptive lady, it always would be. By mid-September, the village of St. Mary Mead had tucked the tragedy of Miss Felicity Emberton's death into that quiet place reserved for things best not discussed at the supper table, but remembered all the same. Her cottage on Lower Heath Lane remained shuttered, its gate half swallowed by weeds, and her name, though rarely spoken aloud, lingered in the air like the scent of turned pages in a long-forgotten book. Yet for Miss Marple, the mystery had not quite ended. It had resolved itself legally, certainly. Owen Graves was awaiting trial, and the Crown's case was solid, bolstered by his confession and young Jonathan Carstairs' testimony. But in Miss Marple's mind, there remained a thread not yet neatly tucked into the fabric of the tale. She found it, or rather, it found her, on a Tuesday morning as she sat darning a small tear in one of her finer blouses. A knock at the door startled her needle from its path. It was Mrs. Pike, the landlady of Miss Emberton's cottage. Nervous and red about the eyes, she held a small wooden box with a brass clasp and an air of intense discomfort. "I didn't know who else to bring it to," she said, handing the box over. "I've been clearing out Miss Emberton's things. The solicitor said I could dispose of what wasn't claimed, but I found this under the loose floorboard in the sitting room." "She must have hidden it there." Miss Marple received it gently. "Did you open it?" Mrs. Pike flushed. "Only just. There's letters. Dozens of them, old and new, some addressed to her, some written by her. But it was one at the bottom. It unsettled me." She opened her handbag and handed over a single folded sheet. Miss Marple read it in silence. "To be read only if I am found dead by unnatural means. My name is Felicity Emberton. In 1931, I was forced to leave my post at the Bath Ladies' Conservatory under threat of public disgrace. The man responsible was Owen Graves, solicitor and school governor. He, the next few lines had been scratched out, refused to allow me to speak my truth. I have since lived quietly with dignity, though I have never stopped grieving what was taken from me. My reputation, my profession, and the respect of my students. Recently, I have resumed correspondence with individuals from that time. Some may support me, others may remain silent. I do not blame them, but I cannot go to my grave as a liar or a coward. If I am found dead and not by my own hand, I ask that this be shown to the proper authorities. Signed, Felicity Emberton." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly and looked up. "You did quite right to bring this, Mrs. Pike." "I didn't know what to do," the landlady said softly. "I never liked her, you know. Too proud. But I didn't. I didn't want this ending for her." Miss Marple placed a hand over hers. "No one wants such endings, but the truth has a way of coming through, even if the telling is delayed." Later that day, Miss Marple walked the letter and box to Inspector Cray's office. She found him poring over witness summaries for the trial, glasses perched on the end of his nose, tie slightly crooked. She set the items down without a word and waited while he read. When he finished, he exhaled slowly. "She was planning for this. She was preparing for the possibility," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Not quite the same thing. I don't think Miss Emberton was a woman who expected violence, but she knew what people were capable of when threatened." Cray tapped the letter with one finger. "This could serve as a posthumous statement, possibly even evidence of intent. The prosecution will be glad of it." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But more than that, it's a chance for her to speak." "Finally," Cray nodded. "We'll make sure it's entered into the record." Miss Marple inclined her head and took her leave, already knowing the next step she would take. That Thursday evening, she visited Cora Langley at the lending library, where the young woman was shelving returned volumes with meticulous care. A small group of girls worked at a nearby table, giggling over their weekly reading assignment. "I hope I'm not disturbing," Miss Marple said softly. "Never," Cora replied, dusting her hands off and leading her to the side alcove. "What is it?" Miss Marple passed the copy of the letter to her. Cora read in silence. At first her face was unreadable, but by the time she reached the final sentence, her jaw was set. "I should have known," she said. "You did," Miss Marple replied. "At least in your heart." "She was stronger than I remembered," Cora whispered. "She must have written this only days before she met him. She wanted to reclaim her story," Miss Marple said. "She may not have succeeded in life, but she entrusted her truth to someone, and now it's up to those left behind to carry it forward." Cora blinked hard and looked down at her hands. "I want to publish it." Miss Marple said nothing. "Not in the papers," Cora added quickly. "In a journal. Something literary, thoughtful, with context. I want her to be remembered for who she was, not how she died." Miss Marple gave her a small, approving smile. "Then you must do it properly." In the weeks that followed, the article appeared in the Bath Review of Letters, titled "A Teacher's Voice, The Last Words of Felicity Emberton." It included the letter in full, alongside a carefully researched essay penned by Cora Langley that laid out the story without lurid detail or sensationalism. It spoke of injustice, of the corrosive power of silence, and of the courage it takes to speak too late but still speak. The response was modest but meaningful. Former students of Miss Emberton wrote into the publication, many expressing regret, admiration, or newly awakened awareness of what had been hidden in plain sight. A few remembered her sternness. Many remembered her precision and passion, and more than one said that, had she lived in another era, she would have been a headmistress or even more. Miss Marple clipped the article and placed it in the same drawer as the note from Cora, the letter from R, and the photograph from the vicarage fete. Not souvenirs, nothing so flippant, but rather reminders that even in quiet villages, stories do not end neatly. That every thread once pulled might lead to another. The autumn leaves began to fall soon after. Children returned to school. The grocer put out his first display of toffee apples, and the world prepared for another season. Miss Marple, for her part, resumed her routine. She visited the church. She checked on her roses. She played whist on Wednesdays and visited the library on Fridays, but every now and again, someone new to the village, perhaps a young curate or a London cousin visiting for the weekend, would ask in passing about that business with the picnic, and someone, usually older, always paused before replying, because the story of Miss Marple and the picnic without a host was no longer just a tale of crime. It was the story of a woman silenced too long, and the people who finally listened. The first frost of October crept into St. Mary Mead overnight, brushing silver onto hedgerows and turning puddles to glass. Chimneys smoked gently. Lawns sparkled under the pale sun. It was the kind of weather that brought out scarves, the scent of wood smoke, and a sudden craving for seed cake. The scandal of the summer, though still whispered about, had settled into the rhythms of village law. One of those curious stories people retold at a safe distance, softened by the comforts of time and tea. But for Miss Marple, there remained one final unease, not guilt and not suspicion either. Rather a feeling, nagging, quiet, persistent, as if a drawer had been closed without being properly emptied. It had begun with a conversation she overheard in the churchyard. Two ladies, neither local, were visiting the grave of a cousin. One wore a fur-trimmed coat too warm for the weather. The other carried a city air with her umbrella. Their voices were hushed, but not enough to escape Miss Marple's ears as she lingered nearby to check the state of the flower beds. "Strangled, wasn't she?" said the fur coat. "Yes," said the other, "but not for the reason everyone thinks." "Oh? Thinks? Oh? Thinks? I heard it wasn't about that man at all. I heard she was blackmailing someone else. Not the man who killed her, but another man. A third person altogether. A vicar's son or some such." Miss Marple's pruning shears paused mid-snip. Rumour, of course. Gossip layered over truth like icing on burnt sponge. But it struck her as peculiar. The notion of a third man had never entered the official narrative, and such stories didn't invent themselves from thin air. Someone had planted that seed, and someone, perhaps, hoped it would grow. That evening, in her parlour, Miss Marple returned to the notes she'd kept throughout the case. Clues, statements, names, the dates of Miss Emberton's letters, the content of young Jonathan's memory, the odd detail of the lipstick, the scarf, and the second set of footprints that had never quite been explained. Yes, that the footprints. At the time, Inspector Cray had attributed them to the young girl, Emily Carstairs. But Emily had sworn she hadn't stepped far into the clearing. And besides, the shoes were too large. Miss Marple fetched her journal and turned to the page she'd marked in faint pencil. Footprints near the hollow, a narrow-soled with worn heels, size unclear but not childlike. Second person? She had been so focused on Owen Graves, rightly so, given his confession, that she had set the matter aside. But now the story of a third man stirred the dust. And the box, she thought suddenly. The one from under the floorboard. She had turned it over to Inspector Cray unopened, save for the single letter from Felicity Emberton. But perhaps the rest of its contents deserved a closer look, if not for legal evidence, then for the quiet truth she so often preferred. She called the inspector the next day and asked, with all her usual politeness, whether she might borrow the box briefly, to review some names for the sake of memory. Cray, accustomed by now to Miss Marple's careful tone and the way it disguised a sharper purpose, agreed without hesitation. An hour later, The box sat on her kitchen table, its brass clasp worn but solid. Inside, the letters were tied with soft cord in neat bundles, some yellowed, some newer. Many were mundane, old correspondences about property, invoices, one or two personal letters of little consequence, but in the third bundle, marked private, Bath Years, she found a name that had not appeared in any police report, Mr. Basil Avery. The name meant little on its own, but the letter was brief and chilling. Felicity, you know I have never condoned what happened. But if you continue pressing this matter, you will force me to act. There are others whose lives could be undone by your insistence on dragging the past forward. Let sleeping dogs lie. You were always intelligent. I hope you still are. B.A. Miss Marple read the letter twice. The language was cold. Not protective, not conciliatory. Threatening, in fact, but not overtly. It was the tone of someone who had once held power and disliked having it questioned. A quick check of the Bath Conservatory's archives, via a favour from her friend Miss Polhampton, now in Cheltenham, confirmed that Mr. Basil Avery had been Assistant Dean of Admissions in 1931. He had gone on to become a quiet figure in academic administration, never prominent, but present. Always present. Never implicated in the scandal involving Owen Graves, but very likely aware of it. Why had his name never come up? Miss Marple sat back in her chair, fingertips pressed together, because he had not been directly accused, because Graves had confessed, because everyone had been satisfied with one answer. But Felicity Emberton's letter, her final letter, had spoken of multiple people. Graves had silenced her. But perhaps he had not acted alone, or worse, perhaps he had not acted first. She reread Avery's letter, then returned to the timeline. The meeting at the Hollow, the invitation, the picnic. But who had arrived first? And then she remembered something else. Young Jonathan had said he saw Mr. Graves kneeling beside Miss Emberton, hands shaking, not strangling her, not attacking her, reacting, panicking. Could it be? She stood, heart quickening with age-honed instinct. The only certainty was that someone had been there before Owen Graves. Someone whose footprints were not accounted for. Someone who had left the scarf, perhaps even planted the lipstick on the teacup. Someone who had gone to that picnic with the intent to silence, and when Graves arrived, perhaps too late to stop it, he had believed himself alone, or believed that if she was dead, it was better to let her remain so. But the true act, the fatal one, may not have been his. She called Inspector Cray at once. By that evening, the two of them sat once more across her parlour table. Miss Marple showed him the letter from Avery. Cray read it, eyes narrowing. We assumed Graves was the killer. His confession was detailed. Because he believed he had done it, Miss Marple said. But what if she was already dying when he found her? Cray shook his head. There was no evidence of more than one assailant. Because no one looked for it, Miss Marple replied gently. Everyone was content with the obvious. Cray said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "We'll need to locate Mr. Avery." He did. And what came next? St. Mary Mead would only half hear of, because it occurred not in the village but in Bath. Basil Avery, confronted with the letter and the revived timeline, cracked. Not instantly, but enough. Under questioning, it became clear that he had intercepted Felicity Emberton's first attempt at public disclosure and panicked. He followed her to the Hollow. They argued. She threatened to name him as complicit, and in a moment of fear or rage he struck her. He did not strangle her. That, he claimed, was Graves, but forensic analysis, when revisited, revealed something new. Felicity Emberton had a cracked hyoid bone, but also bruising consistent with a heavy blow to the side of her neck. It was Basil Avery who had delivered the fatal strike. And Graves, arriving shortly after, found her dying or unconscious, and finished the act thinking he was the cause. Two men. One death, both culpable, but only one guilty of murder. Miss Marple sat quietly the evening she heard the news. The true killer had been found, and yet there was no satisfaction in it, no delight in being right, only a quiet sorrow that one woman's voice had required such violence before it was finally heard. She poured herself a cup of tea and listened to the wind outside. The case was no longer Miss Marple and the picnic without a host. It was now Miss Marple and the death with two shadows. And in the heart of the village, under the beech trees in Bramble Hollow, Autumn leaves drifted slowly to the ground. Each one, perhaps, another secret fallen too late. The trial of Basil Avery took place in early November, under a slate-grey sky and a rain that never quite stopped. St. Mary Mead sent no official delegation, but copies of the Bath Chronicle were passed from hand to hand like sacred texts, smudged with fingerprints and damp from dishwater. The headline told the story plainly enough. Former academic found guilty in murder of retired music teacher. Conspiracy and cover-up unravel in Felicity Emberton case. Miss Marple, seated near the fire in her parlour, read the entire account 3 times, not out of disbelief. She had, after all, followed every thread, but to ensure nothing had been left out. The jury had taken less than 2 hours to convict. Avery's defence had faltered once the court learned of the threatening letter and the newly introduced forensic evidence. He had delivered the blow that rendered Miss Emberton unconscious, and Owen Graves, in his panic and guilt, had finished what he assumed had already begun. 2 men, 1 dead woman, 1 chance lost for her to speak in her own time. Graves, for his part, was released from prison pending further review. The judge, though unsparing in his moral condemnation, noted that his actions, while grievous, did not initiate the fatal sequence. He was expected to live out his days quietly in a coastal cottage in Devon, neither forgiven nor punished in full. The case was over, and yet Miss Marple knew that in some ways the true ending still lingered. That was made plain on a chill morning the following week, when she received a visitor she had not expected. Cora Langley, wrapped in a neat blue coat and gloves the colour of cream, arrived with an envelope in hand and an odd, conflicted look in her eyes. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said. "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "I was just finishing a rather poor attempt at shortbread." "Sit, my dear." Cora accepted tea but didn't touch the shortbread. "I've written something," she said, placing the envelope on the table. "A sort of postscript to the article I published." Miss Marple opened it and read in silence. The essay was titled "The Cost of Silence." It was not about Felicity Emberton, not directly, but about the culture that had allowed her to be buried, not once but twice. It asked difficult questions about justice, gender, and the long shadows cast by institutions meant to protect. It named no one still living, but it made its point clearly. "I want to send it to the Times," Cora said quietly, "but I needed someone to read it first, to tell me if I've gone too far." Miss Marple looked up. "Oh, you've not gone far enough," Cora blinked. "You think so?" "I do. Truth should never stop just where it becomes uncomfortable. That's when it most needs saying." Cora sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "You know, I never liked her. Miss Emberton, not then. Not even when I returned. But that doesn't matter anymore." "No," Miss Marple said. "It doesn't. What matters is that you understood her in the end. And you listened. That's more than most ever did." The essay was published a fortnight later, under Cora's full name. It caused a quiet stir in literary circles, and prompted a short flurry of letters to the editor, some applauding her courage, others tutting at her timing. But the conversation, once opened, did not close again. That was enough. St. Mary Mead, for its part, continued on. The grocer unpacked his Christmas tins. The vicar prepared his Advent sermons. Miss Hartnell resumed her campaign to have the footpath near the station better gravelled, and life slipped into its habitual groove. Except, as Miss Marple knew, it hadn't really. Something had changed in the village, not loudly, not visibly, but in the way people looked at one another. A slight deepening of awareness, a sense that no one, no matter how plain or precise or prickly, ought to be dismissed entirely. Even the once feared Miss Emberton was spoken of now with a touch of softness. Mrs. Bletchley, who had once called her "that frightful vinegar woman," now referred to her as a lady who took things seriously. The shift, though subtle, was seismic in its own way. Then came the invitation. It arrived by post, addressed to Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, on heavy ivory paper. "You are cordially invited to attend a commemorative recital and dedication of the Felicity Emberton Scholarship Fund, to be held at the Bath Ladies' Conservatory, Thursday, December 2nd, Miss Marple read it, set it down and smiled. She attended, of course. The hall was grander than she remembered. Polished wood gleaming beneath chandeliers, the audience dressed in formal greys and blacks with accents of seasonal colour. Cora Langley sat near the front, beside a plaque bearing Miss Emberton's name. Young musicians performed Bach, Chopin, and, with unexpected bravery, an original piece composed by one of the new scholars. Afterward, the headmistress stood and spoke with clear, warm conviction. Felicity Emberton dedicated her life to musical excellence. She held her students to high standards, and she lived by them herself. It is our honor today not only to remember her, but to ensure that what she was denied in her lifetime will be offered to others. The applause that followed was not raucous, but it was long. Miss Marple clapped gently, eyes moist but not spilling. She felt perhaps what Felicity might have felt had she been there. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, but recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that her name had at last been restored. As she left the conservatory, shawl tight around her shoulders and breath curling in the cold, Miss Marple passed a young woman waiting on the steps. She was perhaps 17, carrying a violin case and looking up at the building with a nervous hope. Miss Marple stopped. "First year?" The girl nodded. "Just been awarded the new scholarship, the Emberton." "Ah," Miss Marple said, smiling. "A very worthy one. She was quite the teacher, you know." "I've read about her," the girl said. "Everyone says she was strict." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But only because she believed talent ought to be taken seriously." The girl grinned. "Well, I think she'd like me then." Miss Marple chuckled softly and continued down the path. She returned to St. Mary Mead that evening, the village dipped in frost and a soft hush. The lights were lit in every window. Somewhere someone was burning cedarwood. The hollow, where it had all begun, was quiet beneath the moon. And in her parlour, Miss Marple lit one small lamp, sat in her chair, and picked up her knitting. Another mystery finished, another voice restored, but not the end, never the end. For as long as people keep secrets and justice takes its time, and human nature continues to dress itself in its best Sunday manners, while hiding its Wednesday thoughts, Miss Marple would remain watching, listening, and waiting for the next quiet knock at the door. In the weeks that followed the recital at the Bath Conservatory, life in St. Mary Mead quietly resumed its familiar rhythm, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The leaves had long since fallen, the frost had grown into a quiet companion of the morning, and the shops on the high street were already dusting their windows with artificial snow. Miss Marple returned home from a brief stay with her niece in Eastbourne to find 3 letters waiting for her. One from Inspector Cray, brief, respectful and grateful. One from young Jonathan Carstairs, thanking her for her kindness and mentioning he had started journaling, because stories help me remember things properly, and one unsigned, containing a pressed sprig of lavender and a single sentence. "She wouldn't have spoken without you. Thank you." Miss Marple folded that note last, tucking it between the pages of her gardening almanac. She did not need to know who had sent. It she already did. It had taken the length of the case and the truth emerging in fits and fragments for the full picture to reveal itself. And yet, as Miss Marple would later remark to her friend Miss Weatherby over tea, the answer had been there from the beginning. The picnic, a meal for 2. Yet with only one body found, 2 teacups, one shattered, one with lipstick Miss Emberton never wore, the gloves white, unblemished, except for a torn palm and blood not her own, the scarf, with its faint perfume and incongruous presence, the trail of footprints, small but adult, arriving before Graves, vanishing before he came. Each detail on its own had been harmless, puzzling, but taken together, they revealed something clear to a certain kind of mind. Someone else had arrived first, Basil Avery. He had not come to talk, not truly. He had come to stop Felicity from speaking. He had hoped a gentle warning would do it, but when Felicity refused to be cowed, his fear overtook his control. A slap, a blow, the edge of his ring cutting her temple. She fell, stunned, perhaps fatally so. When Graves arrived minutes later, expecting a confrontation, but finding a dying woman, he panicked. Believing himself already implicated, he completed the act, convinced there was no return. His guilt had been genuine, but not primary. Miss Marple, as always, had watched and listened, not just to the suspects, but to the village itself. People repeated themselves. They revised, contradicted, revealed. What stood out most in the end was that no one, not even the most eager gossip, had ever claimed to see Felicity Emberton smile, until the final week. 2 people had remarked on it. The postmistress and the vicar's wife. She looked almost hopeful, one had said, Hope, that was the clue. Felicity Emberton had never expected justice, but she had dared at last to believe she might speak and be heard. She had laid the picnic not out of nostalgia or regret, but as a deliberate gesture, a civil summons, a quiet duel. And when the men she once feared turned that hope into silence again, it was not the crime alone that required solving. It was her story that demanded rescuing. Miss Marple had always known that murder is not always an act of passion or rage. Sometimes it is a legacy, a pattern, something inherited in silence, enabled by inaction, and finally, revealed only when someone listens long enough and carefully enough to those who were meant to be forgotten. Now, as the year drew to its close, St. Mary Mead prepared for its usual pageantry. A tree would go up in the church hall. Miss Hartnell would lead the carolers with grim precision. The grocer's wife would undercook the turkey again, but among the notices on the board near the church, a new one had appeared. Dedication bench will be installed this spring at Bramble Hollow, in memory of Felicity Emberton, teacher, musician, and seeker of truth, no fanfare. No ceremony, just a quiet promise that someone had been seen, heard and remembered. As Miss Marple sat that evening by her fire, she added the last note to her small private ledger of cases, case closed, murderer revealed. Justice not perfectly done, but done nonetheless, and one more woman once overlooked, now restored to her full measure. She closed the book. The house was quiet. The world, for the moment, was still. And in that stillness, Miss Marple smiled, not from satisfaction, but from the deep, quiet knowledge that somewhere, someone's silence had finally ended, and someone had listened.